Okay, so it's 10 o'clock, so I'll get started. Um, Thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Waterloo is located on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We're on the Haldimand Tract, land granted to the Six Nations to enjoy forever, that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. Now, some elders tell us that the land should also include and account for the tributaries of the Grand River. And so the map sometimes looks a little bit more leaf-like than is usually depicted as in the map we have on the screen. Our work toward reconciliation is centralized in the Indigenous Initiatives Office. And we recognize, of course, that our reconciliation efforts should go well beyond simple acknowledgements such as these. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Veronica Strang. She's a professor of anthropology at the University of Durham, but she joins us today from Bergen. Veronica is a cultural anthropologist who focuses in particular on human environment engagements, and especially with water. Her ethnographic research sites include Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. So Veronica has too many awards and honors to name here, but I want to foreground one. She was awarded an International Water Prize by UNESCO and then went on to co-lead the UNESCO project on water and cultural diversity. She produced a 2017 report called Valuing the Cultural and Spiritual Dimensions of Water to the UN High-Level Panel on Water. She's working with the panel to develop new principles for water, which underpin the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, her major books include The Meaning of Water, Gardening the World, Agency, Identity, and the Ownership of Water, and Water, Culture, and Nature. She's also a strong proponent and scholar of interdisciplinarity and has a number of important publications in that area. So Professor Strang is currently completing a major interdisciplinary project exploring society's changing beliefs over time in water deities. This comparative research illuminates different trajectories in long-term human environmental relationships. And the book, Water Beings, From Nature Worship to the Current Environmental Crisis, is slated to come out early next year, and I can't wait. I'm so looking forward to seeing that. So Veronica's talk today challenges the human-nature binary, argues for collective thinking and new engagements with and ways of thinking about interspecies relations and communities. It's titled Water, Equality, and Diversity, an Interdisciplinary Approach to Interspecies Relations. We'll have, after Veronica's talk, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I encourage you to use the Q&A box available through Zoom here to put your questions there. And thank you very much again. Thank you, Professor Strang. And with that, I'll hand things over to Professor Strang.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind and warm welcome. It's very lovely to be sort of back in Canada. I lived there in Toronto for a number of years in the 80s, but it's actually more than a decade since I was in Waterloo in person, and 5 years since you were very kind and gave me a fellowship, which I never had the freedom to take up. So it's very warming to reconnect with your activities. And I think at this point, it would be good to share my screen with you. We managed this perfectly well a minute ago, so I'll just go ahead and try to make that happen. Are you getting that full screen?
Perfect.
Excellent. This is one of my favorite horses that I broke in my wilder youth in North Queensland, although I don't regard it as a process of breaking, in fact. So, with such an expert water audience, I know that I don't need to give you any introduction at all to the realities of the current environmental crisis, but I do realize that many of you are not social scientists, so I'll just say a little tiny bit about how that crisis looks through the lens of anthropology. And as you would doubtless expect, this is a lens that focuses very much on social relationships, how human societies, human groups within societies interact with each other, and how they engage with other species and the non-human domain. And of course, interhuman and interspecies relationships are always dynamic, they're always social, They're always material. They play out spatially and temporally at every scale, but they're also political in that they are, amongst other things, relations of power. And it's these power relations that decide who gets what in terms of water resources, who gets to form the dominant narratives about water, who gets to make the decisions about what we do in relation to water and the environment. So in essence, water is always the perfect mirror of social and political relations that pertain between humans and between humans and non-human kinds. And part of the dominant narrative that we're all perfectly familiar with is a dualistic vision of male culture, female nature, in which the non-human domain occupies a separate ontological space. Now, of course, any of us who focus our research on water know very well that it flows through and connects all living kinds, and they're not really separate at all. But this concept of nature as the other persists, human and non-human, us and them. And this makes it possible for us to maintain an anthropocentric perspective, in which humankind is always primary and other living kinds are secondary. It presents the non-human domain as a set of resources, which is there primarily to provide humans with food, water, energy, homes, and a range of ecosystem services. And critically, this allows us to give priority to human needs and interests and to externalize the costs of our activities to other species and ecosystems. Or more accurately, it means that we meet the interests of more advantaged human groups at the expense of less powerful human communities and the non-human domain. But my key point today is that not everyone separates human and non-human lives in this way. There is growing appreciation for the need to relocate humankind within the world, conceptually, practically, to challenge that anthropocentricity and the unsustainable practices that it permits. And this pressure for change is coming from multiple directions. And for me, as an anthropologist, one of the most important of these are the alternative models of environmental engagement that are offered by culturally diverse worldviews. Now, of course, one of the great privileges of being an anthropologist is that our job to study very diverse ways of understanding the world. And in doing so, we engage with beliefs and values about human and non-human relationships, which don't automatically divide the world dualistically into culture on one side, nature, non-humans on the other. There are many worldviews that present visions of an undivided world in which all living kinds coexist in more equal reciprocal partnerships. And such indivisible worlds can be found, for example, in the belief systems in iwis in New Zealand, in the Amazonian tribes of South America, in the San in Africa, and amongst the indigenous communities that I work with in Australia, and specifically for our we seem not to have a slide moving on. Specifically for our Canadian audiences. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving my slides on here. Ah, there we go. Just need patience. Closer to home for you, you've got your Inuit communities in the far northern regions, and anthropologist Anne Fionnott Borden tells us that people today continue to see themselves as living in a world of local face-to-face relations, radically different from the national and anonymous relations that characterize the non-native world. A well-known Yupik oral instruction states, "They say the world contains no others, only persons." And often this is used as evidence that all persons, human and non-human alike, or metahuman, are related and should thus be treated with respect. But today, just to give you a brief ethnographic example, I'm going to draw on my own research with Indigenous language groups who live along the Mitchell River in Cape York, which, as you can see, is the pointy bit on the right-hand top of the map here. And they live along the Mitchell River in far north Queensland. And this is an area in Australia that was not actually settled by European colonists until the early 20th century. So many Indigenous communities, although they were displaced into mission reserves or provided free labour cattle stations to remain on their homelands, continued their own cultural lifeways, hunting and gathering and conducting rituals at their own sacred sites in a sentient cultural land and waterscape, which is inhabited by ancestral beings. So when I first went to Cape York to do my doctoral research in the late 80s, this was highly traditional communities with elders who were very keen to teach me so that I could teach others about their customary beliefs and values and practices. And so I was introduced to a cosmology in which the world was created by these totemic ancestral beings in multiple, often non-human forms. And in the story time, or dreaming as it's called, these beings emerged from the great rainbow serpent, which is like the sort of central water being. And this is the major being in the Aboriginal cosmos, and it contains all the other ancestral beings, and it basically personifies the male and female generative powers of the water that is held in the land. So being spewed or spat out by this creator being, the ancestor emerged into a flat, featureless landscape, made all its features, brought into being all of its other living kinds, including their human clans of totemic descendants. And when they'd finished that job, they sat down, as Aboriginal people say, back into the land, where they remained as powerful ancestral presences, watching over their descendants, providing them with resources and protecting their interests. So what this means is that the waters held in the land represent a spiritual, non-visible, non-material domain from which all life is generated. And this is why springs and wells and permanent water holes tend to be very powerful sacred sites. And stories link these beings with sky beings and the celestial domain, and an understanding of hydrological cycles is reflected in a matching view of spiritual movement, in which similarly circulate between this invisible non-material domain held in the land, the material domain of everyday life, and the celestial domains through which water moves. So what we have in effect is a hydrotheological cycle in which natural and spiritual and material life is continually generated. So the rainbow serpent not only generated all living kinds in a creative era, but continues to do so. It has a central role in producing every human spirit, sending it into, sort of jumps up, as they say, into its mother's body, usually from a sacred water place in clan land. And it is to this watery home that at the end of the arc of life, each individual spirit has been ritually returned when they die, to be reunited with, reabsorbed into the ancestral forces in the land, with some part of the spirit entering the celestial realm. So in this sense, an indigenous cosmos, the sky, or what we might conceptualize as the atmosphere or climate, isn't a separate domain either. It's the upper part of a non-material domain containing ancestral powers. And this is very nicely illustrated by the idea of the Milky Way as a sky river or sky serpent, containing ancestral beings and sacred sites, much like the waters held in the earthly level. And I mention this particularly because it demonstrates another contrast with dominant narratives in which climate change is treated as if it's ontologically detached from earthbound environmental changes. And this is definitely something we might want to come back to. But for Indigenous Australians, the generation of each person's spirit locates them in a set of social and spatial relationships in which they have obligations to their kin group, shared rights to clan land and resources. And critically, the rainbow serpent is also the source of customary knowledge, which Aboriginal people call the law. And this provides a vast lexicon of ecological knowledge and an authoritative, holistic template for everything to do with life. How people should use resources, who should marry whom, what constitutes moral behavior. And this knowledge is passed on intergenerationally through songs, stories, rituals, artworks. And so the rainbow serpent and other ancestral beings provide a sentient authority, punishing people who transgress the law. So this is obviously a very conservative worldview. It suggests implicitly that human lives will replicate those of the ancestors. So it's not really surprising to find that it requires a strong requirement to care for country, to regulate resource use carefully. And this means a range of practical measures concerned with keeping the use of all other species low key enough that they can always regenerate. So young people are taught to harvest yams, replacing the main root so that there's an uninterrupted supply, to gather spear rods from trees in a way that doesn't endanger the tree itself. And these also meant keeping human populations under control using traditional methods of birth control. Now, when it came to water, engaging conservatively with ecosystems meant making sure that rivers and streams were not impeded. So people might make little fish traps and weirs to trap a few fish, but it's fundamentally contrary to customary law to interfere with the proper flow of water through the environment or to compromise its well-being. So as you can imagine, this made the activities of the early European colonists very shocking, because they set about drilling down into the hidden ancestral domain to tap the aquifers. They redirected streams into mining and used gold and used cyanide to extract gold, which then leached into and poisoned watercourses. And it's also continued to inform Indigenous responses to the construction of large dams more recently, which can stop the river entirely, and also raised concerns about the redirection of much water into industrial agriculture. So there's a little tiny, very tiny ethnographic sketch, which I hope provides a sense that Aboriginal Australian worldviews, like those of many Indigenous communities, rest on a core belief that the non-human domain, the land, the water, everything it contains, is an active, reciprocal partner in a shared life world with humankind and must be protected and treated with respect. And these values enabled Indigenous Australians to maintain a sustainable way of life for millennia. So in effect, they exemplify the kind of common ownership of resources and circular non-based economies that characterize human societies for actually most of human history prior to the emergence of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And this, of course, was famously described by Jared Diamond as humankind's worst mistake, because it introduced forms of intensified resource use that led to growth and expansion, and which put a lot of societies on a more instrumental trajectory, which became increasingly unstable. So what we have there is Indigenous models of the environment provide us with a quite helpful contrast in ways of thinking about and engaging with the non-human domain that was imported by European colonists into Australia, which within a mere 2 centuries have led to widespread environmental degradation across the continent, and most particular in its aquatic ecosystems. So if we turn to the other half of my research in Australia, over the years I've conducted a lot of ethnographic research, people living, working in Australian river catchments, most particularly the Brisbane River in southern Queensland. And this includes cattle farmers, arable miners, recreational water users, commercial fishers, government agencies, suppliers, and those inhabiting the huge urban areas around the Brisbane River Delta. And of course, these groups are very diverse, and I would suggest have increasingly divided views on how Australian society should engage with water and how it should manage its relationships with rivers and aquifers. But the dominant narrative is one that is founded on the views of the early settlers who came to settle the continent, and I think the term is important, to make the continent productive in European terms. And of course, until recently, Australia's economy depended very largely on its agricultural and extractive industries, and Queensland has a particular history of commitment to land clearance and development, and a very utilitarian view that land and water are there to support these activities. So settlement was accomplished with networks of roads, fences, tree felling, new forms of private property, ownership that displaced the traditional landowners, and thousands of water bores were drilled into the Artesian Basin. The mining boom focused on the rivers was followed by wider extraction of materials for construction. And there was a major port established in Brisbane, which has since undergone massive urban expansion. And as in many parts of the world, this last century brought major water infrastructures, dams and reservoirs to provide water supplies to irrigators, as well as drinking water to urban populations. And they also aim to protect them from the major floods and droughts to which Australian rivers are actually very prone. So we've had a much greater diversity in people's engagements with water, with a shift from a primarily rural population to an urban majority, and with the growth in tourism and recreational use of the rivers and marine areas. And there's been a growing divide, therefore, between extremely utilitarian perspectives and rising concern about environmental issues and the need for conservation. So we have a lot of new river catchment management groups over the last couple of decades. And I could say a lot more to give a properly nuanced view of Australian relationships that these changes illustrate. But let's focus on the fundamental differences between Indigenous beliefs and values and the mode of engagement that came to Australia with the colonial settlers. Obviously, the settlers brought with them a worldview in which the non-human domain is very clearly framed as nature and other. And this was a pretty macho endeavor. It presented the Australian landscape with floods and droughts as a kind of, as in very adversarial terms. So you get these colonial descriptions of virgin territory and a kind of recalcitrant and chaotic mother nature, and which highlight the reality that this binary is deeply gendered, with a sort of feminized, emotional and irrational vision of nature, supposedly opposed to the rationalism of male culture. I won't comment on that. This approach also demonstrated the anthropocentric positionality that I mentioned earlier, and the belief that non-human beings and the material environment are there to provide ecosystem services. And this set the scene for the very instrumental development follows: the introduction of sheep, cattle, crops, other non-native plants and animal species, the damming and redirection of waterways, the overuse of water, soil salination, brutal land clearance, and so forth. All of the factors, of course, that compromise aquatic ecosystems. So what we have here is a cross-cultural comparison that illustrates how indigenous biocultural arrangements, which maintained a very long-term, reciprocal, equal, very sustainable partnership between human and other living kinds, was forcefully displaced by a mode of engagement based on visions of nature and human exceptionalism that brought with it unsustainable material developments and environmentally damaging practices. And of course, this is a very familiar story, I'm sure, to all of you, and it resonates very heavily with a lot of experiences of colonization around the world. So we might think of this as a bit of a continuum, because it highlights a reality. There's actually a very wide spectrum of possible modes of engaging with the non-human domain. So on the one hand, we have those in which people envisage indivisible worlds and relative equality with other living kinds, have concomitant respect for their needs and interests, and maintain sustainable values and practices. And then at the other extreme are these very ontologically divided relationships, which assume highly differential power relations between human and non-human beings and ecosystems, and which permit very exploitative, very instrumental relationships, prioritizing human needs and interests and externalizing the costs to the non-human domain. And that comes with assumptions that growth and development are the same thing, and it's possible to achieve these sustainably. But as I'm sure many of you know, Ivan Illich has argued in these terms, sustainable development is an oxymoron, and there's an urgent need to recognize that development should mean better rather than doing it more. And this takes us into discussions, I think, about creating circular economies that incorporate some of the principles of those that pertained for many millennia. But it remains harsh reality that growth and development discourses and practices remain dominant, and they exert a very homogenizing force on many previously diverse ways of interacting with the non-human domain. So the notion that the world is merely resources for humankind not only underpins national economic policies, it's carried from one geographic location to another by transnational corporations that, while they profit from trade between nations, sit unaccountably outside them, so they're able to supply particular populations of humans with resources at the expense of others and the non-human population ecosystems, while really not being held to account for their activities at all. So this very homogenizing narrative that all things are resources for human use has been matched in material terms by homogenizing domestic plant and animal species, which replace more diverse habitats, and of course have led to the mass extinctions and a critical loss of biodiversity. And this loss of cultural and biological diversity must be a matter of deep concern that calls for three things. First, it requires a paradigmatic shift in thinking to recognize an indivisible world of all living kinds. Second, it demands a serious commitment to undertaking the protective actions towards other species that naturally arise from that kind of rebalancing of human non-human relations. But third, it needs some serious creative thinking about how to initiate practical changes that will make real rather than performative differences to what human societies do in relation to the non-human domain. So this is why I'm keen to promote the idea that we need to learn from very culturally diverse lifeways that persist in the contemporary world, because there are many that exemplify ontological and practical alternatives to homogenizing anthropocentric practices. Now, obviously, we can't replicate traditional lifeways in larger societies, but we can listen to and learn from the tenets, the values that support more sustainable practices. And this is not, of course, a new suggestion. Since the early Romantics, Indigenous lifeways have provided inspiration for conservationists. And today, these romantic visions have been replaced by much more informed understandings of Indigenous peoples' ideas. And these continue to inspire counter movements, which share some common concerns. And this includes national, international conservation organizations committed to preserving cultural and biological diversity. It similarly local and global movements seeking social and ecological justice, and increasingly their efforts to draw attention to human and non-human inequalities have ignited the concerns of wider populations who've begun to realize that mass extinction, loss of biological and cultural diversity, and environmental change arising from current practices are already bringing chaos to our lives. And even in Queensland, which might reasonably be described as quite far to the political right, there are emergent critiques of exploitative human, non-human relations and the intrinsic anthropocentricity that underpins them. So all around the world, different groups of people are seeking ways to shift the balance towards ecocentricity, or at least to rebalance human relationships with the non-human world so that our actions accommodate the needs and interests of all kinds. So nearer to home for you, we have the rock protests, and over the last century with the civil rights and supportive cultural advocacy from anthropologists, Indigenous people have been increasingly involved in national and international debates about environmental issues. But it's a reality that most such communities comprise very small percentages of large populations, usually 2-point-something%, though I think it's about 4.3% in Canada. But many are striving passionately to protect their homelands and their rights to engage with these in ways that uphold their own beliefs and values. So you have some successes. For example, Indigenous communities in Ecuador and Bolivia have persuaded their governments to give constitutional protection to Mother Earth, or Pachamama. And there have been some wins in preventing oil exploration in the Amazon. Some particularly successful efforts have been made to assert Indigenous rights and values in New Zealand, where the Maori community comprises a relatively large proportion, more than 15% of the total population. And during the 10 years that I lived in New Zealand, I became very closely involved in Maori legal endeavours to regain some degree of ownership or control over water and to ensure that traditional values co-compose decisions about water management. So making use of the Treaty of Waitangi, the Maori Council led this debate through the High Court, the Supreme Court, and although there was really no way the Crown was going to let go of the ownership of fresh water, they did manage to establish a very central role for Maori iwis in river catchment management and in decisions about marine areas. And part of this leadership involved gaining some legal protection for forests and rivers by establishing their rights as living ancestors, Te Awa Tupua. So in 2017, the Whanganui River was declared to have personhood and given legal rights equivalent to those of corporate persons. So there's now co-management arrangements, and this enshrines in law the role of two representatives, Taupu Tupua, to act and speak for and on behalf of the river, to promote its health and well-being, and to be involved in assessing any plans that might be effective. There's also been a big push from other parts of the world, for example, with the Atrato River in Colombia, the River Ganges in India, to see rivers recognized as persons with concomitant legal rights. Now, the issue of non-human personhood is a complex and controversial one, which I'm not going to try to tackle today, but whether societies recognize non-human others as persons or not, these ways of thinking do connect usefully with broader conversations about non-human rights, which are also gaining momentum. So there's now growing pressure on the United Nations to make a declaration of non-human rights, similar to that its Declaration of Human Rights made in 1948. There's related pressure on the International Court of Criminal Justice to define ecocide, actions damaging to ecosystems, as an international crime, so that the transnational corporations currently avoiding responsibility for destructive activities can be prosecuted under international law. And we're also getting local activists and larger counter movements seeking top-down leadership from international and national bodies and governments and NGOs. And this has had some effect. Now, the United Nations, of course, inevitably very cumbersome, has to make endless political compromises. But in 2016, it established a high-level panel for water to develop some new principles to underpin its sustainable development goals. And they asked me, as Jennifer said, to assist them with a report on diverse cultural and spiritual relationships with water, which I was very happy to provide. And this led to my involvement as a very tiny cog in the machine in writing the new principles, which I saw as a really good opportunity to bring about, might be more accurate to say smuggle into the conversation, some more radical ideas about non-human rights as perceived by Indigenous communities. So I proposed to the group that we might consider some of the following principles. And as you can see, these aimed to encourage the inclusion of greater diversity and equality in terms of cultural relationships with water. It pushed for ecological justice and the rights of all living kinds. And it did try to, just kind of move things a little bit. Now, it's always impossible to tell whether one has had any influence at all on even quite specialized UN groups. I always suspected something like homeopathy in its level of impact. But the panel for water had some really interesting people in it, and they did their best to move this thinking forward. And they did come up with a whole set of principles for water, which we don't have time to explore here, but they're all online. And as you can probably see at a glance, these very delicately phrased principles are couched in quite uncontroversial language. They retain some very obvious assumptions about ecosystems as providers of services to current and future populations, clearly meaning human. The mention of inevitable trade-offs doesn't bode very well for non-human rights, which don't actually get a mention. And the principles also continue to take as a given the need for sustainable development without posing questions about its linkage to growth. But they do include as a first priority the need to recognize cultural diversity in ideas about water. They do frame the need to seek more equitable, transparent, and inclusive approaches. So we might say that there are some useful ideas just beginning to rise to the surface. And these ideas were expressed a bit more explicitly in the UN's 2018 report on water, which focused on the need for nature-based solutions, though with the dualism. But while this retains that kind of ontology, it is important to know there's a conceptual sort of shift from acting on the environment to working with it. And this is starting to take hold. And this is important because if we go back to our continuum, it implies a rather different human relationship in which the environment is positioned as a more equal other, something to be worked with in ways that encompass more than human needs and interests. So in essence, we might see this as a little tiny shift along the continuum of possibilities towards more egalitarian, indivisible, and sustainable ways of thinking about human and non-human beings. And these changes in thinking are manifested in things like increasing support for green engineering. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the lovely Dutch Room for the River project, which was sparked by problems with flooding in the 1990s. It got going in 2006, and it focuses on the Rhine, the Meuse, the Waal, and the Issel. And it's largely located in the Netherlands, but extends into Germany, France, Belgium, and may even reach the Rhine headwaters in Switzerland. And it was led by the Dutch government, which seeks to do what it says on the tin, really, to focus its infrastructural aims on making room for the rivers by shifting dikes further away from the riverbanks, removing a lot of the infrastructural impediments that impede flows of water, restoring much of the floodplain, and of course, improving the environmental conditions of the catchment area. And I mention this example partly because it encapsulates a long-standing need for more holistic approaches to river management that considers not only rivers and their flows, but all of the species and activities and landforms in their catchment areas. And in Europe, this has tended to mean, the drainage of wetlands, the replacement of biodiversity with crops, use of farming fertilizers, discharge of sewage into rivers, not to mention the use of pesticides and herbicides. And of course, we have a constant expansion of urban areas. And then in addition to all the water using activities of human populations, we have the failures of water companies to treat and supply water in ways that protect the sources. So I could go on with that lesson, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But my point is that the human relationships with rivers are also relationships with the whole catchment area and all of its non-human beings and materialities. So that's its geological formation, its soil, its earthbound and meteorological water flows, and all of the wild and domesticated non-human plant and animal species that catchment areas support. So my key questions are these. We can see some signs of progress towards the new thinking needed. How can we translate this into further movement along that continuum towards more equal, reciprocal, and genuinely sustainable relationships with water and the non-human domain? And how can new approaches be employed in a very diverse range of contexts while also respecting their very specific cultural dynamics? I'd like to suggest just a few ideas about how we might achieve this. The social scientists in the audience will all be familiar with a very classic anthropological text by Benedict Anderson called Imagined Communities, in which he explores the way that we all mentally envisage the various social communities to which we belong. So we locate ourselves imaginatively in family, in kin groups, in professional communities, social groups, recreational communities, political groups, and so forth. So let's take that imagined communities as a starting point, and then drawing on indigenous ideas about indivisible worlds and an inherent respect for non-human beings, I've proposed a wider, more inclusive notion of reimagined communities in which, as well as thinking about the different human communities in a catchment we inhabit, we also consider biodiverse non-human communities with which we coexist. This, of course, is a multi-scalar concept. Now, I have, for the purpose of communicating it easily, focused on how we might do that in a river catchment area, but it's a way of thinking that can be as readily applied on very micro level scales and at macro scales, and indeed needs to be, because water issues similarly across all of those scales. So we need to think about what we do individually in our houses and gardens, how we travel. We also need to think about global impacts of individual and collective choices. But a river and its related ecosystem is a very practical scale to start with. How might we, in contemporary industrial societies, reimagine communities so that we can do some joined up thinking about river kinds within river catchment areas? So if we think there is really a need to think more inclusively and equally about diverse communities, the next question is concerned with interspecies or pan-species democracy. How can the needs and interests of non-human beings be democratically represented in the decision-making processes that affect their health and well-being and their capacities to flourish? Who will speak for and promote their interests? How might this be practically incorporated in formal and informal processes of governance? Now, I don't wish to suggest that non-human beings and ecosystems are merely the passive subjects of human representation, any more than they are or should be the passive subjects of instrumental human decision-making. It's very important to recognize they are active participants in human, non-human relationships, that they co-create the life worlds that we all inhabit. And working on water, of course, very readily brings home a reality that we're dealing with anything but a passive, amenable element. And I'm sure we could all speak at length about how water acts upon us individually and in our lives and many radical sorts of ways. But the point is that all species are busy acting upon us and each other, whether it's by crowding out native species, digesting or recycling soils, maintaining grasslands, or for that matter, infecting us with coronaviruses. But my point is we need to include in this equation a very key awareness that our life worlds are dynamically co-composed of interactions between human and non-human actors. But of course, while all species have ways of communicating, and many of us are convinced that we know exactly what our pets are thinking, very few non-human forms of communication are genuinely accessible or translate readily into conversations about how to manage land and waterscapes. So there is a need for human representation of other needs and interests, and it's therefore useful for us to look at models like that provided by the Whanganui River case, which establishes a formal role for the Te Putua to speak for the river in legal and managerial discussions that might affect him. And to some extent, this role of speaking for the river resonates with the aims of many catchment management groups and conservation groups who long sought to speak for and promote the interests of their local waterways. But such groups are generally quite peripheral to decision making. They might apply pressure, they might influence debates about what happens to the river, but they're very rarely supersede dominant groups and dominant narratives. So I want to draw attention to a structural problem in that water governance reflects the dualism that I noted at the outset. The governance of river catchments generally positions environmental knowledge, usually in the form of environmental agencies, quite separately from agencies concerned with economic and social issues. So, for example, in the UK, we have on the one hand a very weak and underfunded Environment Agency pitted against much stronger commercial interests, including a privatised water supply industry and other social pressures such as the need for housing. And of course, this division pertains politically and practically in the academy, with very well-funded natural science disciplines and conventional ecosystem services thinking dominating governance, while very chronically underfunded culture-orientated disciplines, the arts and social sciences, with their much more critical perspectives on paradigmatic norms, tend to sit on the margins of decision-making. And I would suggest that this excludes more radical thinking and maintains a very particular status quo that is dominated by specific ideologies and short-term political aims. But as we already know, this business as usual scenario, though it protects the interests of power groups, is not sustainable. So there's a need to get going with the paradigmatic shifts that will rescue future generations from a climate catastrophe that James Henson called storm. So this suggests that we also need to rethink the structures of governments and arrangements, the decision-making process. First, to remove the nature-culture divide and incorporate with a good measure of equality more culturally diverse range of knowledges, and second, to employ these to consider a more inclusive range of human and non-human interests, a reimagined community of living minds. Now, such restructuring can be tailored to suit different cultural contexts. In many countries, as I've said, there are indigenous communities, wealth of ecological knowledge to bring to the discussion. So this might be done by bringing councils of elders into decision-making for it in a very real way. It might mean establishing more diverse river catchment management groups. Most have people with a lot of local knowledge, fishers, farmers, recreational users, conservation groups. But there are also a lot of people with expertise to speak about it. You could speak for non-human needs and interests. And in the academy, along with the social sciences and humanities, of course, we have all these wonderful material scientists with expertise about things like soil scientists who can tell us how soil microbes might be affected, the geologists and hydrologists who could describe about landforms and how they act on catchment processes, and of course, biologists who could speak for the multiple flora and fauna that depend upon the river and so forth. So you can probably see where I'm heading with this. There is a need to remove the dualisms of anthropocentric hierarchies that separate culture and nature, and to embrace equality and diversity encompassing the human and non-human communities in river catchment areas. And there's a concomitant need to remove the intellectual dualisms and hierarchy within the academy, and to seek equality and diversity in the forms of expertise that are brought to bear on decision-making processes. This could potentially achieve the genuine interdisciplinary exchanges of knowledge that would enable better decision-making for all of the human and non-human communities in catchment areas. And I think with these kind of constellations of biocultural diversity, it is going to be more possible for humankind to move towards sustainable lifeways in which all living kinds can coexist and flourish. And I will stop there. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Strang, for that really wonderful and brilliant talk. I have several questions for you myself, but we've got some great ones in the chat. So perhaps we can start off with that. And we've got one in particular that I quite love. So in the chat, we've got, can you comment on the role of interdisciplinary approaches in addressing water challenges? What specific role can or has anthropology played? And I promise I didn't put that in there.
Well, thank you. That is actually a lovely question, which I'm delighted to answer. I think anthropology has a really important role to play in facilitating interdisciplinary exchanges of knowledge, because, as I have tried to practice myself, it has a particular expertise in cultural translation. And in many ways, when I ran an institute in Durham for 10 years on interdisciplinary in the way that your own wonderful institute is. And it was really not dissimilar to working with different groups of people in a catchment, because in essence, interdisciplinarity is about learning each other's languages, beliefs, values, worldviews, understanding the political, social, economic relations between groups, and enabling that exchange of knowledges, which is, of course, the most vital thing for creating more holistic ways of thinking. I've been very involved for my sins, and I must have done something dreadful for this, in the research assessment exercise here in the UK, the REF. And one of the things we spent a lot of time doing was to define what we meant by interdisciplinarity for the entire university sector, which was a very interesting debate. And what we actually fixed upon was one that I came up with a colleague, which was basically about the fact that in order to be really interdisciplinary, there has to be a genuine exchange of knowledges across disciplinary divides. And in order for that to work best, and I've promoted this as best I can in my own institute, that requires a measure of equality, because partnerships and exchanges of knowledges don't work as one-way streets. So I think that anthropology can help partly by providing that kind of reflexive view of how interdisciplinarity works, but also by understanding that this is also a political and ideological process that is taking place. So I think they have a really important role to play in assisting people in doing that kind of translation across boundaries.
What a wonderful answer. I love that. Thank you so much. So we have another question here that is, while our world has different systems of knowledge, including traditional or indigenous and Western, all with appropriate quotes, it seems most power remains within Western systems. How do we empower other systems?
Great question.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, that's a slightly monolithic view, isn't it? Because I actually think there's quite a wide range of views, even within, Western society. But there is no question that we are living in a world that is very heavily dominated by particular ideologies, by large-scale instrumental societies. And I think instrumentality itself is an interesting problem, because it, in a sense, it's like a juggernaut that we can't get off, that we have this kind of way of engaging with our water infrastructures and flood controls and so forth. But it's there's a wonderful piece by Alfred Gell about the enchantment of technology and the sort of allure of control. And when you think about it, a lot of human societies seek to create stability for themselves by exerting control. And it takes a small scale, rather brave view to think maybe we should be exerting less control than more. Our instincts are always to kind of not make room for the river, but to control the river. So I think we are up against a very lopsided equation. So what can make a difference? Well, we were talking a little bit before the lecture about tipping points. And I'm encouraged by the fact that there are now a number of confluences taking place between indigenous communities and their much more vocal participation in international debates. There are real concerns coming from long-standing conservation organizations. The wider population is scared to death about what is happening in terms of climate change, etc. Politicians are realizing that business as usual isn't really feasible, even though they're happy to be very short-term. And my hope is that if those things can come together productively and really work together, that there'll be a kind of critical mass, a tipping point at which things shift into a very different dynamic. And so I'm very encouraged by this pattern of young people in pushing for different life ways. I think it's much easier to be radical in your 20s than when you're comfortably mortgaged to the hilt in your 40s. So that's my hope, is that somehow these things will come together and just tip things enough that it will make a difference. And I think we all need to just keep our shoulders to the wheel doing that, or perhaps that's the wrong metaphor.
That's great. Thank you. So we have Lauren, who's asking, given that people tend to act more insular when facing threatening scenarios like climate change, How can we encourage and incorporate diversity of people, of ideas, etc., among those who are in power of sustainable decision-making scenarios?
It is a difficult question, isn't it? Because I think that Lauren's right, that people do tend to draw back into what they know, what's conservative and what's familiar under pressure. And I've never been a great believer in frightening people into action, because I think it tends to create denial and resistance and controversy and fear. And fear is not a great motivator. But on the other hand, you know, we are living in a climate of fear that is caused by environmental change. So maybe we do need to work with that a little bit. But what I'd really rather see is good leadership. I think the great secret to this is leadership that is inclusive and diverse and imaginative. And how we get that, not much of it where I'm coming from, but you know, I think that is the secret to it, because in a sense, you need the imaginative leadership to go, okay, why are we chopping the world into environment and housing, transport and the economy, when clearly all of those things need to be joined together in order to make sense about how we actually materially act on the environment. So I think some structural rethinking would help a great deal, but it does need some visionary leadership, and we're not getting that so much from politicians, but we are getting it from people like David Attenborough and Polly Higgins and Jonathan Haidt, and all, you know, David Suzuki. I remember being a big hero when I was living in. So there are people out there, George Monbiot, who are shouting loudly and clearly about what we need to do, and I think in many ways that's where the leadership is coming from. But I would love to see a greater equality in the academy, such as that the arts and social sciences are less sort of marginalized in comparison to the kind of more conventional view. I think that's actually really important.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be really lovely to see. I agree. As well as visionary leadership in our politicians. Okay, so we've got a really good question here as well. How do we avoid the noble savage syndrome, where we romanticize traditional societies, including their values, relationships, stewardship, etc., of the environment? How can we be respectful but also not be afraid to be critical?
That's a really nice question, and I kind of hope that we're past that, but clearly there are very different views. I mean, you know, this is very easy for an anthropologist to go, sorry, didn't we leave that behind 100 years ago? But clearly it hasn't vanished, and there is some romanticization. And I think, you know, the exchange of knowledge is key. The more we understand the complexity of Indigenous ways of living in the world, the more we can see that this isn't just some kind of romantic stereotype. You know, the Aboriginal people I've worked with in various parts of the world are very pragmatic, down to earth, but they simply take a longer term view, that they have a duty to generations. It's not that they're afraid to exploit resources, they just don't see the point of exploiting them in such short-term ways. So I think part of this is educational, part of this is empowering Indigenous communities. And I mean, I've seen a real change in my now rather lengthy lifetime. When I first started working on these issues, Indigenous communities didn't really have that much of a voice in international fora. Whereas now, when I work with UNESCO and the UN, Indigenous voices there, loud and clear, speaking up, talking about the complexity of their lives, talking about the realities that they're confronting, talking about their own needs to have flourishing economies and jobs and so forth. You know, there's not a lot of romantic harking back to any kind of noble savage life ways. It's much more about how do we take care of future generations? How do we take care of the whole world for future generations? And that's the message that I think is coming across. And you look at some of the Indigenous leaders who have been making impacts. I mean, there's another area of visionary, passionate leadership that's just so important. I mean, I've learned so much from Maori colleagues and Aboriginal colleagues in Australia as well about, you know, you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, I've been writing about water deities, water serpent beings, and people are utilizing these imageries and ideas to explain the notion of an indivisible world, one that is inhabited by all living kinds. So I think Indigenous communities have, you know, I mean, communications technology has made it so much more possible for people to speak in international fora. So these days, if you go to The Hague, there'll be a whole slew of people there from around the world, but there'll also be vastly more coming in digitally to have their say. So I actually think communications technology has been a really important tool for Indigenous activism and continues to be. And also that Indigenous communities are exchanging a lot of knowledge about what works in terms of effective activism. So yes, I see a lot of good stuff happening there. And I hope that with that, we can really leave the whole noble savage thing behind. It seems terribly outdated to me. But you still get some very outdated ideas about anthropology as well and what we do. So yeah, there's a bit of work to be done there.
There still is, I'm sure. Thank you so much. So we don't have any more questions in the chat, but I'm wondering if I could ask a couple as well. I really love your idea of reimagined communities and ways of taking seriously, reciprocal relationships. And I found myself wondering as you were speaking, how do invasive species fit into these kinds of models?
Well, I'm not sure we want to use those kinds of categories of species. The species just do what they do. They're all trying to cover space and light and water and soil and sustenance. And that's what we all do. I mean, the idea that the humans are the only exploitative species on the planet, we aren't particularly good at it, it has to be said, but all species are trying to exploit their environments and dominate environments and take territory and so forth and flourish and outbreed others. This is something they all do, and it's partly about having that balance of representation across species that becomes important. So if you have a river catchment that is just chocker with water hyacinth or lantana, then people speaking up for other species would be pointing that out and saying, well, actually, in order to manage the democratic rights of other species, this means doing something about invasive species and so forth. So in a sense, it's like any form of democracy. Democracy is all about balancing rights. It's not about, it's always about creating an equitable balance between rights, if you like. So in a sense, if we extend that thinking to non-human species, the representation would reflect that. And it's a really interesting question as to how you can democratically represent. You can't represent every species in a catchment. We'd have to be quite sensible, I think, and do as we do in social research, get a sensible cross-sample, cross-section across the different kinds of species so that all the key ones have a say, as it were, have somebody saying, well, actually, this is what they need. And perhaps that this one is being a little bit, out of order. So it really follows some of the same rules that we're trying to follow with human democracy. It's just a little tougher.
Yeah, and especially, go ahead.
There's an intrinsic power relation, of course, in being spoken for, and Karen Barrett has written about this very interestingly. But in a sense, we can't get away with it when it comes to representing non-human kinds. But I would love to see some of our material scientists thinking about how they would represent the needs and interests of the species that they work on, or the landforms that they work on. I think that would be such an interesting project. I mean, what I'd really like to do is to put together a project that pilots this way of managing a river catchment and brings those disciplines together so that we can actually test it out, see how it works when you start from that very different starting point. I think it would be really good to do. And I've been talking with some water industry people here about maybe taking that forward.
Fantastic. Sounds wonderful. Okay. We have time for maybe one more quick question, if anybody wants to pop one in quickly. Nope. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, it was a great pleasure.
And fantastic for me meeting you.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry that I haven't got to meet you all in person, but hopefully as things improve, we might manage that one of these fine days. And in the meantime, thank you so much for thinking about your wonderful questions and for your very kind hospitality, and for many thanks.
Thank you, Professor Strang. And thank everyone else for joining us as well today.